Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Family Couch. I am so excited to have with us on today Sarah Leitschuh, and we're going to be talking about young children and emotions and how to not lose your sanity in trying to help them manage their emotions. So Sarah, before we get started, can you give us a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mercedes, for inviting me to be on with you today. I'm excited to be here. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I practice in Eagan, Minnesota. I've been working with families in a therapeutic setting for the last 10 years. So I work with children one-on-one, but I also work with parents and children together, as well as with parents without their child present, just around a variety of different stressors that children may face, as well as education just about how do we help kids learn to talk about their feelings and be comfortable with them and cope with them in age-appropriate ways, because the way you and I deal with our feelings might be totally different than what's going to work for a child.
Right. And so I know we'll be talking about young children. So when you say young children, what kind of age range are you looking at in terms of young children?
Well, really, when I go out and talk to families, I'm generally talking about children under 10, but primarily children in that 2 to 5-year-old range, because I think we need to be making sure that we're talking with kids about feelings from a really young age so that they start to feel comfortable expressing their feelings and acknowledging it, and they're not too young to be coping with emotions at that time in really healthy ways. And if we don't catch it early, we're dealing with older kids that don't really know how to deal with feelings.
And that last age range that you talked about, that 2 to 5, is usually where, and you can tell me, is this where you see this kind of surgence of emotionality coming from children?
Absolutely. Right. It's like all of a sudden our children turn into beings that feel emotions super intensely, right? But they don't yet have the skills to figure out, how do I let my mom and dad know what I'm feeling in a way that is manageable, right? It usually comes out as like maybe a big explosion, like a tantrum, or maybe, all of a sudden we notice behavioral changes that are really an indication that a child's feeling a really intense emotion and they don't know how to express it.
Right. So to the parent who's listening and is like, okay, right, terrible twos, I've heard of these, I know about this. What can parents do to kind of either get ready for that or to manage it while your kids are starting to have this huge explosion of feelings all of a sudden?
Right. I think the first thing is awareness, right? So listening to this podcast and realizing that seeing this intensity of emotions in your children is normal, right? Like I have a lot of families that reach out to me that think there's something wrong with their child, and it's really overwhelming and intense for them because they can't figure it out. I think that's the first step, is realizing your child's perfectly normal. There's some things that we can do to help the child start to be able to recognize what their emotions are and cope with them. But there's also things we can do as parents or adults who love children to take care of ourselves so that we don't get caught up in that emotional intensity as well.
Right. And you mentioned something that I think is really kind of prevalent for me too as a parent coach, which is that when kids begin to have these emotions, it feels very abnormal because you went from having a kid. And again, sometimes parents skip terrible twos as well, right?
Yeah.
So you have a kid that's pretty docile, pretty chill, and then all of a sudden it's like, bah!
Right.
So like what, let's talk about maybe one or two things that you tend to give parents to help them manage those blow-ups, those meltdowns.
Right. Well, the first thing that I always talk about with parents is taking a deep breath, right? And I mean for the parent, but then also for the child, right? That we need to be as calm as we can when we're trying to support our child through like really intense emotion. So of course we want to take in our deep breath, get ourselves in the best state that we can, but also by doing that, we're modeling that behavior for our child. And I kind of like to encourage parents to help their children take a deep breath. So get down to their level, say, you know what, I can tell you're really upset. Let's take a deep breath. Let's figure this out. I'm here for you. But that breath helps both the parent and the child get their body and their brain in the right place to actually be able to connect.
Right. And I think you mentioned a very valuable point, which is when our kids are going kind of haywire and having their meltdowns, it's really hard for us as adults to say, let me not go there as well.
Right.
Right. Because
Absolutely.
if we're both there, it's kind of hard for either of us to get back to normal in any kind of reasonable time. Right.
Absolutely. And I think that's actually like the most important thing is how the adult responds, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have 2 kiddos at my house that are in 6, and I know that it's easier for me to say that than to actually do it
Right.
sometimes, right?
Right.
But I do notice that the more calm I am, the more calm my children are
Mm-hmm.
in response to
Mm-hmm.
me. They definitely pick up on our energy
Right.
and feed off of that energy.
Right. And so now that we kind of have this idea, okay, I stay calm, I help my kid make sense. What can we do after maybe a meltdown or before a meltdown to help our kid have better language or better skills for the next one?
Absolutely. I think that I liked how you worded that question, Mercedes, because I do think a lot of what we're doing with kids in terms of building their comfort around emotions has to be done when a child is in a good, calm
Right.
state. Because when your child's melting down, they don't want to hear you say, oh, this is the feeling that I know that you're having. Because especially as they get older, they'll be like, no way, mom, you're totally wrong. Or dad, you're
Right.
totally wrong.
Right.
Right? So we want to be talking about feelings every single day, and we want to normalize talking about feelings. And right,
Mm-hmm.
this is why I say even someone that's younger than 2 can start learning about feelings,
Right.
right? Because if mom and dad or grandparents or whoever's with the child are starting to talk about emotions and the child is hearing that and they're
Mm-hmm.
seeing that modeled at home, they're going to have those
Yeah.
skills.
Yeah.
You know, they're going to be familiar with those words. They're going to think
Right.
this is a normal thing that we do. We talk about our feelings. We
Right.
ask for help with our feelings when we're
Mm-hmm.
having a hard time.
Right.
So that's why I always say, like, in your natural environment, incorporate feelings into the dialogue, right?
Right.
And it's okay for your kids to know that you, as a caregiver, have feelings too.
Yes. Yes. And I think that's something that can be difficult because as adults, we have our feelings processed. We don't have to talk about them as much,
Mm-hmm.
right? We know what we're feeling. We can kind of move through it. So what would you say to that parent who's like, I'm not used to talking about them. I'm not used to, I always keep them in my head and just move through it.
Yep.
How do I externalize what I'm feeling so my kid understands it?
Right. Well, a lot of times I work with families on creating like a new family ritual
Mm-hmm.
around communication of feelings. So, like, one example would be having like a feelings check-in at dinner
Mm-hmm.
time where each family member goes around and says maybe 2 feelings that they experienced
Right.
during the day and an example of a
Right.
time that they did it. And if you incorporate it into your dinner ritual, that is just kind of like part of the normal routine, right? Like, so it's,
Yes.
you don't have to have that extra step of thinking about it.
Yes.
Another ritual that a lot of families do is reading like a bedtime story or a set
Mm-hmm.
story time. That's another great time to incorporate discussion of feelings because you can talk about the different characters in the books that
Yes.
you're reading and what
Yes.
types of emotions they had. And a lot of times it's a great time to talk about coping strategies too, because you can say,
Mm-hmm.
you know, this is how this character dealt with that feeling. What would you do if you had that same feeling?
Yeah. And I think you mentioned something that for our busy families, it's really integral that we have those common family moments, whether it be dinner or game time or family night or whatever, where we can
Yep.
all be together. Because I can tell, even with parents with young kids, everyone's going every which
Oh,
way,
absolutely.
you know?
Absolutely. It's busy to be a
Yes.
parent.
Yes,
Yes.
right. And so finding those times, or like I like the idea of having it be a ritual where everyone knows in the family that this is going to be the time that we're going to get to talk about feeling. We don't
Yep.
have to talk about it, right before soccer practice. We don't have to try to talk about it in the morning while everyone's trying
Yep.
to get dressed,
Right. Yep.
right?
Right.
We have a designated time to do that.
Yep. And when I talk with families, I try to be as practical as possible. I'm not trying to give families 20 new things
Right,
that they need to be
right,
doing. Let's incorporate this stuff into the routines that you already have
right,
in place.
right. Well, like you said, everyone has to eat. So why not have
Right.
a family dinner, right? We all have to eat
Mhm.
dinner at some point. So we
Right.
have to do that, or we all are going to go, hang out together. So let's have those moments where we can talk about feelings. I think it's really important to have those moments too, because again, like you said, families are so busy that it takes time to really understand each other and feel safe. So if we're all
Mhm.
busy and we don't have a space to feel safe, it's hard for
Yep.
kids and for adults to talk about their feelings.
Right.
right?
And what I think about is talking about feelings is hard for kids because they don't necessarily always have the language
Mm.
or the skills, but as they get older, they do have the language, right? But if you haven't set that foundation of I'm a safe person to come talk to about what you're experiencing, then they're not going to be able to do that.
Mhm.
So a lot of what we're doing when kids are really young is setting that foundation
Right.
to build a strong relationship that will last through the
Right.
decades.
Right. And now let's talk about kind of the other extreme, because there are parents who have kids who do talk a lot. The kids
Mm-hmm.
will nonstop tell them what's going on, whether it's feelings or just some random thing they experience. How do you manage as a parent a kid who talks a lot? Maybe you're not pulling teeth to get them to talk, but you can't get
Right.
them to be quiet.
Sure. That's a really good question, Mercedes. I would kind of look at what's going on with that child. I
Yeah.
would kind of be curious about why are they filling time with
Mhm.
talking so much? Like a
Mhm.
couple things like pop in my head right away. Like I kind of wonder, is that child craving some attention
Mm.
from their parent? Is that child experiencing some anxiety? Because sometimes we talk a lot just because
Mm.
we need to fill space, and
Mhm.
time. There's attention deficit disorder, which I don't like to diagnose
Right.
really young kids with that, but it's something that kind of dings in my
Right.
back of my brain. So I kind of look at what kind of purpose is the talking filling,
Mm.
and then kind of approach it from that direction. But some
Yeah.
kids do just need help with creating containment and boundaries.
Yes.
And
Yes.
sometimes it's just that, right? Like that we
Right.
help our children learn this is, an okay time to talk, but sometimes mom and dad are talking, right? And that's
Right.
okay. We don't want to interrupt mom and dad's conversations.
Right.
But there could also be other underlying issues that I would want to be looking at as
Right.
well.
And it sounds like on both ends of the spectrum that the idea is to really get to know your child, to really understand
Absolutely.
what's going on with them. So if you have a kid who's not talking, it might be because they don't have the skill set. And if you have a kid who's talking a little bit more than normal, it might be because they have some underlying things going on with them.
Yep, absolutely. I agree with that. You really want to know your child. And I think what's hard as parents is a lot of times our children have different personalities than we
Mm.
have, right? And so
Mhm.
there's some negotiation, some tolerance that we have to learn in order to appreciate our child for who our child is,
Mhm.
even if their
Mhm.
personality might be a little different than us.
Yeah. And can you talk about that a little bit? What does that look like to develop that level of tolerance if we have maybe a more outgoing kid, but we're maybe more shyer as a
Sure.
parent?
Absolutely. That's actually the number one situation that comes up is
Yeah.
differences in comfort in interacting with other people.
Yeah.
Because I'll hear it both ways, right? Either my child's super outgoing and I'm not, or I'm really outgoing, but my child prefers to
Right.
play alone, right? And
Right.
it's kind of like that tolerance. And a lot of times what I talk to parents about is like a norm of a range
Mhm.
of what's normal, right? And an understanding that just because your child is either more outgoing or quieter than you doesn't mean that they're outside of that norm
Right.
of the range,
Right.
right? And that there's value in their approach to the world and there's value to yours. And
Mm.
what can you both learn from each other as you grow in your parent-child relationship?
Right. And I like that piece that what can we learn from each other? Because if you're a very outgoing parent, you might be able to learn more stillness from your child who is
Absolutely.
quiet, right? And vice versa, right? If you have a more outgoing child, you might learn how to get out more and talk more because your kid
Mm-hmm.
wants so much more interaction.
Absolutely. Yes. And I mean, sometimes people are surprised by that idea of like, let's learn from our children, but we all are learning from our
Yeah.
children all the time, right? They
Yeah.
push us out of our comfort zone from the moment they're born
Yes.
or arrive in our
Yes.
family, right?
Yes, yes. I always like to say that kids, like whatever you think you have neatly stored, kids come into your life and just knock all those things
For
down. Like,
sure.
nope,
Yes.
you're not okay with that. Let's talk about this stuff.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
And I think, here's something that you can tell me in your professional opinion. I think when our kids begin to do that, they begin to trigger and knock stuff down and untidy things that we thought we
Mm-hmm.
had tidied up. What can a parent do to kind of maintain their emotionality when they thought they had something really nicely tied up, but their kid comes and just kind of pokes at it?
Yep. Well, a couple of things come to mind right away when you say that.
Yeah.
One thing that I always work on with parents is it's okay to not respond right away, right? Like sometimes
Mm,
your child comes out with something and it's so overwhelming for you as a parent that you don't know what to do. And it's, maybe it's triggering something from your past. And I oftentimes think the best thing to do in those situations, rather than say something that maybe later you're going to regret, is
mhm.
to say, you know what, I wasn't expecting that. Let me just think about that a little while and let's circle back, and
Right,
make sure you do circle back. But that gives you
right.
that time to step back and reflect and respond to whatever it is that your child presented to you
Mhm.
with your best self versus your triggered self.
Right.
The other thought that came to my mind right away was, this is why it's so important for us as parents to have a support system, right?
Mm,
Of people that we really trust, that we can kind of go to and say, hey, this is what was triggered for me. And that might be just your other parent friends. It might be a family member, but maybe
right,
it is a professional
right,
therapist, or, other type of professional that we need to just kind of go back and revisit some of that
right.
stuff we thought had been fully resolved.
Right, right. And I like that idea that there's a spectrum of things that you can do to support yourself. You can take a step back, you can get support from people who you care about, or you can get professional support. And I love that because I think at every level, there are certain things that trigger us that we can just step back from and then come back into. And
Right.
there are some things that we're like, I can't touch this. I need some other help
Yep.
for
Right.
this. So I love that you gave those options to be able to work through it.
hmm that ability to say, like, let me come back to you, to your child, I think is a really hard skill
Mhm.
to master, because a lot of times we feel put on the spot, right?
Yes.
And we
Yes.
don't want to like make our child feel like we're dismissing them, right? Or we're
Right.
not hearing them.
Right.
But I think it's also okay for our children to see us say, you know what, I just want to make sure that I've really thought this through before I respond. I think
Right.
that is an important skill to have.
Right. I agree. And I think sometimes too, our kids appreciate it more because sometimes, especially with younger kids, their brains are going a mile a minute. So they'll say something and be done with it before you can
Right.
even answer them. So it's like, like they don't really mind sometimes. I think older kids might want more, but I know if we're talking about younger kids, they'll say, Mom, why is this? And you'll say, like, okay. And they'll be gone outside. And you're like,
Right.
okay. Like, because
And
they just
inside
so
you're
quick.
like exploding, like, oh no, shattered my
Exactly.
worldview.
Exactly, exactly. And so, one of the things that I want to also talk about in terms of emotionality is how do we help parents kind of figure out what level of emotionality we should give our kids. So you have parents who are really like us, who are healers and who have this full breadth of emotionality and emotional vocabulary. But where should a parent start with their younger kid? Where should they start to develop that feelings vocabulary or that emotional understanding?
Sure. I usually like to say, like, let's start with the basics, which
Mhm.
are, in my opinion, four key feelings. There's the happy, the sad, the mad, and then I put like worried and scared together when I talk
Mhm.
about like my top four. So I always say, let's start there. Let's give children those as the foundation, right? And
Mhm.
then follow their lead. Ultimately, we want children to be able to maybe be a little more nuanced in how they talk about
Right.
emotions, but that really is the starting point.
Right.
And as your child feels more comfortable talking about feelings and develops more of an understanding of feelings, then you can introduce some of those variations. And I
Yeah.
always say, too, like, consider the age of your child, right?
Right.
Like, a really young child doesn't necessarily need to know. Like rage, right? Like
Right.
that might be a more advanced word
Right.
that you'd introduce to a child
Right.
as they get older, right? And
Right.
they kind of recognize a range of anger.
Right. And so for the parent who's like, all right, I get it. I get it. I've done this, but my kid still is not using the language. They're still not doing any of the things. Like even if we come up with little, signs, they're still not doing it.
Sure.
Where do we give that parent or what direction do we give to that parent?
Absolutely. That's a great question, because I think talking about feelings is really, really hard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Lots of adults don't want to talk about feelings. They don't want to use their feeling words,
Right.
yet we expect
Right.
children to
Right.
use their words, right? And that's not really the natural way of
Right.
children to communicate, right?
Right.
They communicate more to us through maybe play or art or physical
Mm-hmm.
activity, right? So I work a lot with parents on being open to the fact that your child might be communicating their emotions to you through these other means, and that we
Mm-hmm.
can kind of, as parents, be detectives, right? And look for those types of things, right? Like when your child's playing and you notice the same theme over and over again, maybe you help bring that to conversation with your child.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like, you know what, I noticed you're playing this theme over and over again. I wonder if you have been experiencing some worry about that, right? So we
Mm-hmm.
help them, we let them know that we are in tune with them,
Right.
and we kind of guide them.
Right. And I think that's a really good way to think about it because, for parents, like I did all that, I talked, but they're still not getting it. Maybe they are getting it, but they're showing it to us in
Sure.
another realm, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not saying, Mom, I'm angry, but maybe they are having their action figures fight all the time. They're like,
Right. Yep.
oh, that's his way of showing that he's angry,
Right. Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And then if we can validate for children, that's a really okay way for you
Yeah.
to express your anger. And like,
Right.
I picked up on that.
Right.
And like, we can start to help them label that. And eventually they might be able to communicate through their words as well.
Right. And I think that's a really interesting kind of thread too, that when we see our kids act in certain ways, how to determine which of those ways is healthy and which maybe isn't so healthy. Because I feel like when parents see kids do that, like they might see them playing with their action figures too aggressively. Oh, don't do that. Oh, they shouldn't fight, because they don't want their kids to pick up on those type of
Sure.
aggressions.
Yep.
So how does a parent figure out, okay, what my kid is doing is a healthy way to express it, or maybe I need to give them another way because that way is not as healthy?
Mm-hmm. Well, I really, when I, watch children play, I try to approach it from a place of curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of times we put our own adult interpretations on what a child is playing that is totally different than what the child is intending, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we see a child banging action figures together, we presume that it's aggressive,
Right.
but that might not be what they're trying to convey in that way of playing. So I kind of ask questions about that, like, oh, I noticed you were banging those two figures together. Tell me about that. And then you might find that the child has nothing aggressive that they're actually playing out in that interaction, right? Like, oh, it's just I wasn't coordinated enough to play this the way that I intended. So there's that caution. I always try to approach anything with curiosity versus an assumption. But then I also think it's okay to work with children on boundaries of like, okay, so when you're playing with action figures, they hit each other, okay, but in real life, we don't do that, right? Like children can get that idea of play versus real life. So saying to a child, when you're playing with your friends, we're not going to do that. That's a rule that we have. And they can get that. Like kids are really black and white. So if you say, this is a real life thing versus a play thing, they can really get that.
Right. And you brought up another idea, like the idea of play versus real life. And one thing that's kind of circulating in my head is kids who, again, talking about younger kids, but it might even follow them into their older years, is kids who hit, fight, do things like that to express themselves. How do you help kind of turn that around? Because what I see usually is that kid is having a hard time expressing themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But how do you turn it around so that way they can do it in a more healthy way?
Right. I agree with you that when we see those types of behaviors, the hitting, the kicking, the biting, it is a child who's really struggling in figuring out how to let people know what they're experiencing. And that's the way that they know how to do it, right? They haven't figured out other ways to communicate that. They haven't mastered that. Maybe they don't feel comfortable. I'm not saying parents haven't tried to teach them other ways, but maybe the child's just not comfortable with that. So they kind of default to their normal biting, hitting, kicking type of thing. So what I really work with parents on is identifying what the unacceptable behavior is and helping a child find a replacement behavior. So if you're frustrated with your friend, instead of biting them, let's do this, right? And like, I think that proposed alternative really has to depend on the setting, right? What's allowed at home is probably different than what's allowed at daycare or school setting. So really fine-tuning those alternatives for the child. And we actually have to really coach our child through that, right? They're going to naturally go to their default behaviors, and we need to be there with them and guide them through that. Okay, remember when we're frustrated, I can tell you're frustrated right now. This is what we thought we would try, and help them with that.
So what I'm really liking, kind of that thread of what you're saying, is that we really, if we're going to give our child an alternative behavior, we have to first understand what that biting or that hitting was trying to accomplish in the first place. So if they were frustrated with a friend, we have to give them an alternative behavior that will help them manage that frustration. right? Is that what you're
Absolutely.
saying?
Yep, absolutely. And it's tricky with young kids because sometimes they don't have the language to explain it to us,
Right.
or it's just so overwhelming to them that they don't understand it themselves. So as adults, we kind of have to stand back and like observe these interactions in order to really understand it, because sometimes we misinterpret a child's
Yes.
behavior. Like, for example, a lot of times when I work with parents, they'll come in and they'll say their child's demonstrating these types of behaviors, like the biting, the hitting, the kicking, and it's understood as anger, when actually, as we do some investigating, I think it's more anxiety involved, right?
Mm.
So then the way you would approach that is a lot different, right?
Right.
We want to help a
Right.
child identify what their triggers are for anxiety, help them develop some calming skills, and then hopefully the behavior would resolve versus being really disciplinarian around the behavior itself.
Right. Right. And like you said, I like the idea of letting parents know that this is a very complicated thing. Because again, even as adults, our emotions are complicated. We might be
Right.
yelling, but it's not because we're mad. It might be because we're excited and we're
Right.
starting to
Yeah.
talk really loud.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I totally understand that.
Emotions are so complicated.
Right.
And I think when parents show up here in my office for their first session with their child, a lot of times they'll hear me say, I'm not going to label anything about your child right now. Like, these are some of my hunches about what's
Mhm.
going on, but I want to get to know your child better,
Yes.
right? Like, in a 1 hour meeting, I'm not going to be able to figure out exactly what's going on with that behavior either.
Yeah.
And I
I
think
like
most
that.
parents respect that.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, it's also frustrating when you want to fix that behavior as soon as possible.
Right, definitely, definitely. Well, I know that we could probably talk about this, topic ad nauseum like forever, but I
Right.
definitely want to give you a space to let our audience know where they can find you and where they can get more of your resources.
Sure. I have a website, which is my name, Sarah Leitschuh, counseling.com. And I know that this will be in the show notes, so that'll be perfect
Well,
because I have a really long and complicated name. So Mercedes will take care of that. But you
yes,
can also follow me on Facebook. I have Sarah Leitschuh Counseling has a Facebook page, and I have a Twitter account, which is just at Sarah Leitschuh, my name. But all of those links will be in the show notes, which will make it super easy for anyone who wants to follow me. And I do blog about some of these topics that we talked about helping children learn how to talk about their feelings
yes,
and creative ways to help children express emotions, as well as some ideas about coping strategies. We didn't even really get into that today, because
right,
this is a very complicated
yes.
subject.
I agree with that. And so I was going to ask too, do you still do like workshops and groups in your local area?
Yep, I do offer educational workshops either at my office or like through community education here in Minnesota. But I don't have any right now. I don't have any webinars or anything like that for the larger audience.
Nice. But I will say, if you are in Minnesota or are close enough to Minnesota to get there, I would totally, go and see what Sarah has to say because she is amazingly insightful. And yes, I know we didn't get to coping skills, but I'll say this. I think if you guys go to her website, like she said, it will be in the show notes, her website and all of her social media links. She has so many great articles and so much great insight about how to manage and how to help this. But I hope that this intro kind of has given us a more of a reframe of how to see our kids' emotions and how to see what could be going on underneath what we
Mhm.
see them doing.
Right. And regardless of whether you're in Minnesota or California, I know that Mercedes has a lot of parenting support that she
Yes.
offers through the internet and whatnot. But then also, I encourage you, if you ever have a question, don't hesitate to connect with any mental health professional about your child and whether their behavior is within the range of norm, because the worst case scenario is they say your child's totally normal, right?
I love it. I love it. Well, again, thank you so much, Sarah, for being on with us today and sharing with us so much of your insight and wisdom about children and their emotions.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Mercedes.